So I had this huge response to my sleep training video that I shot with Natalie Willis, who is the baby sleep trainer online. She has been kind of a godsend to me, which is why I brought her back for this video. Say hi, Natalie, to everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
So I brought her back because I want to talk about toddler sleep training, which is a completely different beast than infant sleep training. And it's something that we really had to implement with Nikosh, especially now during quarantine. And I wanted to bring her on so that she could answer all of your questions.
Awesome. Well, I am so excited to answer all of the toddler-related questions.
All right, so if you've been following me for a while, you know that I sleep trained Nikosh when he was an infant. He was about 6 months old, and it completely changed our world because we were suddenly like, oh my goodness, this is what it's like to sleep. The way we did it is we got a plan from Natalie because this is what she does. And when I shared this online, it turned into this whole thing where people were obsessed with the video. I think Natalie, you also probably heard from a lot of people that were watching the video. I think it really changed everyone's perspective on sleep training and why it's necessary and the way to do it. But then fast forward to now Nikosh is 3 years old. We, kind of let things just kind of go with having a newborn in the house and also with self-quarantine and the pandemic stuff. There were just kind of no rules anymore, and we started to realize we had to do something about it. And actually, Natalie had gotten in touch with me and she was like, I have a feeling you need a little bit of help with Nikosh, right? Because I think where you were probably sensing from some of my posts, right, that we're not sleeping anymore, right?
Well, and there was a new baby in the house, and I think I was chatting with you about the baby and was like, how's Nikosh doing? Because there's usually a little bit of I think I was getting more calls about toddlers than I was about infants right at the beginning because it really disrupted most kids' sleep, including older kids, not just toddlers. So you were not alone for sure.
Toddler sleep training just feels much more intense in a lot of ways, to me at least. So I think, Natalie, first, let's talk about what is the difference between infant sleep training and toddler sleep training?
That is a really great question. So in some ways, it's exactly the same, obviously. In other ways, it's completely different. I would say the element that makes it a lot different is the crib. So when we talk about infant sleep training, if your child isn't capable of climbing out of a crib and they're 2.5, then technically you still can train them like an infant, even though they talk to you, even though they stand up, all of those things. That doesn't really make a difference. It's the introduction of the bed and the child's ability to come and go from the room at will. That's really the major difference, because that's a whole different thing, right? As you're maybe having to close the door, or your kid's pounding on the door. The way that it's the same though, is that it's ultimately about the child learning how to fall asleep independently and not relying on you. And so I like to think of the bedroom as a crib. We don't really have any huge qualms about putting our babies in cribs, even though they're confined. We don't really have a problem with putting 2-year-olds in a crib, even though they're confined. But once we talk about confining them to a bedroom, all of a sudden that's very triggering, and it's definitely a lot harder, and you're, again, not alone in feeling that way. But I would say those are the ways that are similar and different.
Okay, so Natalie, let's kind of approach it from somebody making an appointment with you for toddler training. What is the process of this?
Yeah, so my consultations work really similarly no matter who I'm working with. One interesting thing about Baby Sleep Trainer is that we have online courses for infants and we have one-on-ones with me, but with toddlers, I only work with clients one-on-one precisely because it is a way more emotional process. People think maybe it gets easier when kids get older, but in some ways it's harder. So I always start by making sure that I really have a complete understanding of what's going on, because every family's got different dynamics. Are there siblings? What's going on with your partner? What's your home like? I also want to make sure that we know what we're trying to work towards. And with toddlers, I always want them, believe it or not, I want them to be able to go down, alone, awake, in their bed, in their room, choose to stay in their bed until the morning, until a time that you deem is the time for them to get up. And if they're still napping, same type of thing, but a lot of independent sleep. We spend a lot of time talking about the bedroom because, like I was saying earlier, the bedroom really needs to be treated as a crib. So it has to be really safe in there. And a lot of what I talk about is how do we make the room safe? And that's where it's going to go into a lot of detail depending on what's going on in your home. And then there's a few ways that toddlers tend to thwart us during sleep training. So maybe they turn the lights on and off, maybe they take off their clothes. I mean, just any number of different ways. Are they getting into their closet? So we spend a lot of time talking about the bedroom. And then we talk about how to train them. And I would say in some ways it's really formulaic, but of course it's going to be different depending on each family. But there's a few kind of different elements, which I'm sure we'll go into in more detail in a few minutes. But really, I like to do toddler training only with kids who are 2.5 and older. Usually under the age of 2.5, it's not really possible to train them if they're not in a crib. And that's one thing I think is super, super important for people to understand, is that if your child is, say, under the age of 2.5 and they're climbing out of their crib, you're kind of in a little bit of a no man's land until they're 2.5 or older, because they're not old enough to understand and comply. We sort of use a lot of visual elements and visual aids to work with the child where they're at. So we have a chart that we use to help them go through the bedtime routine. The chart helps them be really happy and engaged, because typically families are in a pretty negative space when they come to me as far as their kids' sleep is concerned. And the child, I'll tell you, every child at 2.5 or 3 years old who's having these issues with their parents, that child knows that you don't want to be sleeping with them. So they're already kind of tense, because there's always this dynamic at bedtime where mom's pissed and like the child's like, please don't leave, right?
Right. So completely. No, when you said that to me, it just like, it was such a strong feeling. We were like, he does know we don't want to sleep with him.
Yeah. And so I work around a lot of how the child is feeling and how they're interpreting what's happening. And so you really have to start kind of putting some boundaries around sleep. And so we really then introduce this concept of consequences. So their choice is to stay in their room or to leave. But if they leave and they keep using their choices, eventually the consequence is that they won't have the freedom to open their door and leave. And we don't use a lock, depending on what's going on in the home and the architecture and that sort of thing. There's different ways that we can keep a child in a room, but ultimately, here's where it's really similar to sleep training with infants. No matter what anybody tells you, all forms of sleep training are cried out. All of them. There may not be extinction, but they're all cried out. So at a certain point, if your child keeps using all of their chances, the consequences, the door is closed. Absolutely, will they be upset? Definitely. And of course, this is where we would have gone into way more detail when I get to work with people and talking about how to deal with that, and maybe even checking with the pediatrician before we do this training. But that's kind of like the basic process that we use when we sleep train toddlers.
I think people don't understand how important this consultation with you can be. The thing that really made it very important for us was, one, my husband sat through it with me, right? Like, so he got to hear what you had to say about everything. I think we both have different perspectives of what's happening as well, right? So like, I'm saying that, this is just what happened, and Maroon's over here saying, well, it's because of Susan and her allowing him to take advantage of us and stuff. So like, there are these different perspectives, one. Two, I feel like, we both needed to be on the same page of what we were gonna be doing and what the plan was. And it really gives us the opportunity to hear it from you, like, this is the plan. You're both agreeing that you're gonna stick with this plan. You even convinced us that we didn't want to get rid of Nikosh's daytime nap, but you were like, this sounds like he's at a point where he needs to get rid of his daytime nap.
Right.
And that was one of the big game changers for us, was when we finally committed to like, okay, we're gonna get rid of his daytime nap. It was hard during self-quarantine, especially because that was our break during the day.
Totally.
Because he, we have this whole day with him instead of letting him go to school.
Right.
So, we didn't want to give up the daytime nap, but I'll tell you, giving up that daytime nap and just having him going to bed earlier has been such a game changer for us.
Right, and that's where it's going to vary. There's signs that children are ready to give up their nap. Most of the time they're not, but when they are ready to give up their nap and you don't give it up, it can be like impossible. And I wanted to touch on two things that you said. First of all, I think one of the roles that I play that's probably the most valuable is just someone to be accountable to. Frankly, people have invested money in this. There's somebody who's there, who's checking in. And so that makes a really big difference. And the other thing is that by the time families get to me, they're so beaten down when they have a toddler that's not sleeping. And so the dynamic is really frayed, typically between the partnership, and there's different interpretations of what's going on. And you have just tried and exerted so much willpower, and you're not sleeping. So typically you're coming to me after weeks or months of like fractured sleep and fighting, and it's such a terrible situation. You can't even see straight. You can't even figure out like, what should I do? And so I feel like when I can come in and evaluate everything that's going on and say, here's exactly what we're gonna do to fix this problem, and someone who's done it like hundreds or maybe at this point thousands of times with toddlers, that really helps, because I'm sure sometimes I encounter things I haven't seen, but I can't remember the last time that happened. So I think the experience can be really helpful too.
All right, so just so you guys know exactly how we sleep trained actually, Nikosh. So he was sleep trained as an infant, and then at some point I got a little too casual and I messed all of that up, and then he started relying on me and Arun, my husband, sleeping with him. So somebody had to be sleeping with him at some point in order for him to actually sleep through the night. So we decided we needed to have a plan. We contacted Natalie, and then Natalie set an appointment with us, and we had a long conversation. I think it was like a 45-minute, maybe even an hour conversation about what was going on. Then Natalie walked us through what she thought was, what was happening, gave us a plan, and then even helped us understand what we might experience while we implement the plan. We put the plan aside, we waited for a second because we were also traveling. So this was actually right before the pandemic. We went on a trip to Mexico, and we had decided we weren't gonna implement the sleep training plan because we were gonna be traveling, and that just can add a whole new layer to it. So I told Natalie, we're gonna wait until after our trip. Got back from our trip, pandemic happened, all rules went out the door. So we were really a mess for like a few more months after that. But Natalie's plan was essentially, and this is like really oversimplifying it, the plan that Natalie gave us was we were going to essentially treat the room like it's a crib. So if he leaves the room, then we're gonna make him come back to the room, and he gets 3 tries. So Natalie told us, put 3 Post-its on the wall after you've gone through the whole list of like our nighttime routine. So each time we go in, if Nikosh is like coming out of his room, then we go back in, put him into his bed, we pull 1 Post-it and we say, you only have 2 Post-its left. If I pull all 3 Post-its, then we're closing the door on you. And that has been one of the best things that the best trick just in general with Nikosh was having these like limits for him that he can visually see. One thing that was really helpful that you told us was not to assume we're going to have to close the door on him because most toddlers don't actually get to that point. And we didn't believe you at all. You were like, trust me, like you're probably not gonna get to that point, but you need to have everything in place in case. We've never actually had to close the door on Nikosh, not once.
That's great.
Which has been amazing. So that was a really summarized concept of our plan. So what we ended up doing, and this is I think where it's a little bit different than the actual plan that you gave us, is we ended up moving Isla, our baby, into Nikosh's room so that she could have her own room, knowing that we wanted to sleep train her and not ruin that at the very least. So we gave her his room and we moved him into our room and gave him a toddler bed next to our bed. And then we implemented everything that you said. Our bedtime routine starts at 6:45 p.m. And we started doing that because Isla seems like she's more of an early nighttime sleeper, and also we cut out Nikosh's nap. We take both babies up at 6:45 p.m. We start bath time. Bath time lasts for only 5 to 10 minutes. And after that, my husband and I split the duties. So he goes and deals with Isla and I deal with Nikosh. We put his diaper on, put his pajamas on. He doesn't wear a sleep sack anymore. I read him 1 book. He gets to choose 1 book. I tuck him into his bed, give him some water, remind him he's got 3 chances tonight, which we've actually kind of slowed down on doing, but this was like for the first month especially, I'd remind him he's got 3 chances. If he feels like he wants to get out of his room or out of the bed, he's only got 3 chances and then mommy's gonna close the door. And then from there, I give him a little like kiss on the cheek, tell him I love him, and then say goodnight, turn off the light, turn on the sound machine, and I'm out the door. And that's essentially our bedtime routine. It's very, obviously there are a lot more elements to it, but that's essentially in a nutshell.
I have a question. So you are still sleeping in the room with him, but the idea, it sounds like, is he's going to sleep independently at first, and then you're going in later in the night. Yeah, and I think one thing that's probably interesting, I'm really happy that worked for you, and anyone who knows anything about me or Baby Sleep Trainer or Susan, we've worked together a lot in the past, is that at the end of the day, it really needs to be what's working for the family. So I'm not the type of person that's gonna be like, well, this is different than what I said, and so therefore you're not doing it correct. At the end of the day, what matters is that he's getting sleep. I find that one thing families often do after we work together, whether they're, I would say typically, they're implementing what we talk about in like a really, I would say like pretty consistently, but once they understand the concepts, they're able to kind of pick and choose what works. And I would say the Post-it note one, so this is something where we represent to the child, like, this is how you know that you're losing your chances, right? And I'll say for anybody who tries to implement this on their own, first of all, you have to make sure that their room is really, really safe. That's really important. That's actually one of the huge things that I talk about when I work with my clients, and that your pediatrician approves of what you're gonna do. But you do not ever wanna be in a situation, if you shut the door on your child, where you're holding it on the other end. Don't ever get in that situation. Usually the better thing to do is to cover the doorknob with a plastic cover. And really, once you've committed to closing the door, if you're talking to your child through the door, this isn't going to work, because you have to think about them being a fire and you being oxygen. And the more that you talk to them, the more upset they're going to be. And like Susan said, most kids don't even get to the point where they're going to lose their Post-it notes, because all of a sudden you have created a currency where one did not exist. They didn't give two craps about whether the door was open or closed, but once you said this is a consequence as a result of your behavior, then they can really be successful with that. And then one final thing is that if you are going to do this and put your child in their own room, use a toddler clock or something that represents the beginning of the day, because maybe they don't lose all their Post-it notes at bedtime. Maybe they'll get up in the middle of the night, and that's where you have to close the door and that sort of thing. And so consistency, like hyper consistency, is really important, but also doing this correctly. And I just cannot overstate how important it is to do it safely. You never want to put your child in a situation where they are in any kind of danger or their room isn't childproofed or anything like that.
Yeah, and for all of you guys wondering, Natalie recommended these door covers, and I'll leave links to all of this stuff. Doorknob covers that make it impossible to open the door from the inside. So from the outside, you could open the door, but your toddler cannot open the door anymore because it doesn't allow the knob to turn. We've never had to use it, but we had them ready to go just in case we had to use it. And then as far as the clock or the light that you were talking about, you recommended the Hatch one, so we got the Hatch light. And it's also a sound machine, so that it doubles as a sound machine and a light that lets your child know that they're allowed to come out of the room at this point. So you control that with your app. So I'll leave links to all of that stuff too in the description box. All right, so I asked members in our private Facebook group, our fam private Facebook group, if they wanted to ask you any questions, and there are a lot of them, so we're gonna answer them, but I'm gonna summarize some of these questions because they can be a little long-winded.
Yep, no problem, let's do it.
All right, so one of the questions, to summarize it, is that their daughter used to be an excellent sleeper. She is still in a crib as a toddler, but now, because she's older, she'll get so mad if they leave that she will throw up on herself. And so then they go in there and they basically rock her back to sleep. She'll fall back asleep when they put her back down. From what I'm reading, it sounds like they're letting her fall asleep while they hold her, and then they put her back into her crib. But then she'll wake up in the middle of the night, go through the whole crying process.
Of course.
Well, and then they end up being so tired that they bring her to bed with them. So they want to know, what is it that they're doing wrong?
Yeah, so
I already know what you're gonna say because you've already given me, crap about this one.
So first of all, lots of families co-sleep. There's nothing wrong with co-sleeping or bed sharing as long as you're doing it safely. I'm not here to tell you that you're unique. This is probably in some ways kind of like what people would consider a dirty little secret. And so I'm just putting it out there that if you're wondering, lots of people do it. There's nothing wrong with you. I wouldn't even necessarily say that these parents are doing something wrong. I would just say that if this dynamic isn't working for them, then the main issue, like I say with all families that I work with at every age, is that child doesn't know how to fall asleep independently. It sounds like the parents probably know that, and so they're like, well, we should be putting her down awake at bedtime, but then she gets so upset that she throws up. So actually not that uncommon for kids to vomit. I would say, first of all, if you're going to do any kind of formal sleep training, and this is an issue that your child has, you really need to avoid anything, definitely don't be doing milk within 30 to 60 minutes. Unless they're less than a year, milk shouldn't be part of their bedtime routine if they have a vomiting issue. Same thing with dinner. Try to be thoughtful. Maybe move dinner 90 minutes before they're going into their bed. That's an important thing. And then call the pediatrician and say, look, I'm having issues with my child sleeping and I really want to sleep train them. I have this plan that I'm going to follow. You need a plan. You could just wing it, but you're less likely to be successful in this situation if you don't have a plan that covers what you're going to do at bedtime, what you're going to do with overnight wakings, what you're going to do with naps. Unless there's signs of illness or the pediatrician has an issue with it, then you should be okay to continue. You want to probably prepare for the child throwing up. So putting garbage bags outside the bed, that sort of thing. Most of the families that come to me with this issue, I'm able to modify what's going on so that they just they never even throw up. So of the 10 kids I have in, let's say a year who have this issue, maybe only 1 or 2 of them ever ends up vomiting. And if you have a younger child who's doing this, and your question, this comes up a lot, which is, well, do I feed the milk again because they just threw up? Let's say that they're under the age of a year and they're watching this and the baby throws up, and understandably, it's another question for your doctor. Say, do I need to feed them again? Because guess what's going to happen if you feed them? They're probably going to throw up. And frankly, feeding them is what triggers a vomiting. And so getting an okay from the doctor, then they say, yeah, it's okay. You can skip this feeding. You don't have to worry too much about it. I like to work in conjunction with pediatricians because we're talking about a child's body, and you don't want to be making decisions like this. Even just with a sleep expert, like me, you want to make sure that you're including the doctor at every step.
I'll tell you this, Isla's obviously, she's 1 now, so she's a toddler, but while we were going through sleep training with her, I tried to take a little bit of a different approach. I think I felt like I'm a vet now, I know what I'm doing.
Yes.
So I was a little bit different in my approach with her. And she's also just a different baby. And, you know, she's really much more defiant and strong-willed. Like Nikosh was kind of like, all right, you're sleep training me, or I'm going to go sleep now. But with Isla, it's been a little bit more of a process. And there was one night when she did throw up in her crib. And I was like, oh my gosh, is she going to be one of these babies where we can't sleep train her because she's going to throw up? And then I really took the day to reflect on what it was that I did that might have caused her to do that. And really what it was is that I kept going in there and checking on her, and it started to piss her off that she felt like she was really close to getting me to like bring her to bed with me, in my opinion.
I think
and so I had this realization.
Yeah,
I had this realization that like the more I was checking on her, the more she was like, really, you're gonna like not actually take me? And it started to really get her mad, and that caused that. And so the minute I slowed down on the checking in, and I was just kind of like, we're gonna have to deal with this, she actually calmed down. It seems almost counterintuitive, but and you would think like they're gonna actually cry even more if you're not gonna go in there, but it actually caused her to not cry as much and not be so mad. And she ended up, you know, falling asleep better because I wasn't going in so often.
The stronger willed a child is, the less involved a parent should be with the sleep training. I'll just leave it at that. So that's a really common misconception, and you got it right on when you realize that.
Okay, so one of the questions that seems to be a big topic among the members of the Facebook group is room sharing. And not room sharing with parents, but with an infant and with a toddler. They want to know how to do it, basically.
Right. Okay, so I'm really, really excited to talk about this topic. So I'm going to say something that is going to be a little unpopular, but my goal is to just give people the honest truth that they might not be hearing in other places, because it's unpalatable, to be honest, sometimes in this space, and I'm going to do it anyway. 1, if at all humanly possible, do not pair children in the same room before the age, both children being like 4 or 5. Below that age. Okay, so if you don't have to do it, I know you want to do it. I understand where people are coming from, and I'll tell you how to do it in a minute, but if you don't have to, don't do it, because it just introduces all of these elements that are going to blow up your life. The older child is the one that determines whether or not the room pairing is going to be a good idea. I'm going to be very stereotypical here. If you happen to have, let's say, a 5-year-old daughter who's very maternal and generally very soft-spoken, and you explain to her, I'm going to put your 6-month-old brother in here with you, but when you go to bed, you need to be really quiet and you need to be my helper and you need to not wake them up. And she's like, okay, mommy, that's probably a successful pairing. If you have the 3-year-old son that all of us have who's like, what? And they're like loud and they are screaming and walking around, turning the light on, and you have a sleeping baby in there, that's not going to work. You may want it to work, but you're better off putting your child, your infant rather, in your room. If we're going to be doing any kind of pairing of rooms, it should be with the parents instead of with the children together. So keep that in mind. There is a product that I love called a SlumberPod. It's a pop-up canopy. It's designed by a woman who's sleep trained who then had to room share with her baby, and it did not go well. Even if you end up having to pair siblings together, using a SlumberPod is really, really, really great because it darkens the area. You can put the white noise machine in there. There's a little slot for the camera. It's breathable, so on and so forth. You can't use it with a crib. You do use it with a pack and play, but the kid doesn't care what they sleep in. So if you have to pair children together, try to create physical barriers between the infant and the toddler. One really major issue is rambunctious toddlers who are not in cribs climb into their siblings' cribs, right? Really, really problematic. The other thing
that's exactly the reason why we haven't done this. Like, that's why we didn't use your plan to the T, is we were like, you know what? We know Nikosh. He's going to bother Isla. He's going to try to get in there. He's going to try to take her out of the crib. Yeah. He's going to do a lot of stuff because he's just so excited and rambunctious and wants to play when he sees his sister. So we were like, he's going in our room. Yeah, and that's right. So figuring out something that you're more comfortable with, what is probably better in terms of room sharing you with one of your children. So creating a physical barrier, really important, making sure that white noise, darkness, and especially like the older your child is, being really clear about your expectations around like, you are a team member in this discipline that I am trying to implement with this other child. Now, these are all making assumptions that a family has chosen to sleep train one or both infants. So if neither one of your kids are sleep trained, it doesn't really matter. You should pair them because they're probably having some sleep issues anyway. And so really, what difference does it make if they're in the room together? If you have an older child who's sleep trained and a younger one who isn't, nobody likes to deal with a 3-year-old who's awake in the middle of the night. And so another problem that can be introduced is like if the infant is waking up
the toddler. Most kids, if you don't do anything, by the time they're 3, 4, or 5, will, even if they have issues falling asleep, lots of kids will get to the point where they're sleeping through the night. It's this biological maturity thing that occurs. So if you're going to introduce a younger sibling into a situation like that, even if it's not perfect with your toddler, address the baby sleep issues first before you introduce her into that sibling's bedroom, because you don't want to take a child who's sleeping well and introduce a baby who isn't sleeping well. Think that about covers it, but avoid it if you can, separate them if you have to, and try to involve your older child in kind of being a team member with what you're doing.
All right, so another question that I'm generalizing is, it seems like some people put their toddlers down, even probably their babies down, and even though the toddler's not crying or, not making any noises or anything like that, they're still staying awake in their crib or in their bed for an hour or so before they fall asleep. Do you think there's an issue with that?
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that when you put your child down awake and they stay awake, is even sometimes they're not crying, it's like maddening. I don't know another word to use to describe. You're like staring at the monitor and you're like, why are they awake? Why are they awake? Like, it's been an hour, and you're like, they're not sleeping, they're not sleeping. So I'm acknowledging that that is very normal and very common, okay? So I want to break this down into 2 categories. If we're talking about a child who's, let's call it 2.5 years, 3 years and older, and they're still napping, it's very normal for children who nap to just not be able to fall asleep before 9:30 or 10 o'clock. That does not mean that you need to keep them, you can if you want to, but it doesn't mean that you need to keep them up and awake with you until that time. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you need to drop their nap. I tell my families to keep their nap unless the child is unable to fall asleep until say 10 or later. So sometimes what'll happen is kids are up till like 11. That's problematic. But if you have a child that's say going to bed at 7 or 7:30 and rolling around and staying awake until say 9:30 or so, yeah, I think it would probably be a good idea to move their bedtime a little later. If you're comfortable with it, you might as well keep them up until 8 o'clock. If you want to do that, if you don't, allowing them to roll around and be awake. I think everybody's tolerance for this is a little different. Some families don't care if it's like an hour and a half and their child, and the child's like, actually, to be totally honest with you, toddlers and kids are entertained all of the time now. They are never expected to be without stimulus and be okay with that. So if your child's like happy and they're like talking and pretending and whatever they're doing, there's not really any harm in that. So don't let that stress you out too much. Now, if you have a child who's 2.5, 3 or older and like either pissed off or they're being mischievous or they're not able to fall asleep before 11, that's when you really need to start thinking about cutting that nap. I think another thing that happens a lot is a child will fall asleep maybe okay at bedtime, but then wake up in the middle of the night and be awake for an hour and then go back to sleep. Again, 3 years old and older, either one of those issues, waking up for a long period of time. And it's almost like, especially when they're not crying, it's even more of an indicator that it's time to stop the nap. And so the way to do that is to really just say, okay, we're gonna only do a nap every 3rd day, and we're gonna do that for 2 weeks. And then we're gonna only do it every 4th day, we're gonna do it every 5th day, we're gonna do it once a week. And eventually you'll get to the point where maybe a child will like fall asleep on their own playing at 3:30 for 20 minutes. And especially coming from a sleep trainer who I'm so regimented, if that child's gonna snooze for 20 minutes or they're gonna maybe crash in the car a little bit here and there when they're giving up their nap, not a huge deal. And then, like limiting their nap on the days they do nap to like 60 to 90 minutes, and then just slowly like taking it away. The lack of sleep will aggregate for them. Sometimes you don't just wanna cut it and stop doing it if they are really used to napping, because it'll make it harder for them. So gradual shift out of that is helpful.
It's like weaning them from a nap, which is what you had us do with Nikosh, and that worked out really well. But we definitely had like a grouchy toddler for a couple of weeks.
Yes, totally. But allowing them that nap every 4th day can be really helpful to kind of keep things together a little bit. You know
what's funny about you saying that, it's fine that they talk as long as they're happy and laying there in bed, it's totally fine. We actually see that Nikosh on the monitor will sing like songs that he's learned during the day, or he'll talk to himself, and he has like full-on conversations with himself, and seems like he's having just a grand old time, and then suddenly he's out. Yeah. So we've just let him, just let him sing and talk to himself. And that's an important
skill for him to have as he grows older, is like, okay, I'm like chilling myself out, like that's all good stuff.
Another question that seems like it's coming up in the group is how you address your toddler's fears. So at this point, something that makes them different from an infant for sleep training is that they can tell you that they're scared. They're scared of the dark. They're scared of maybe monsters. Lately, because it, like Halloween and everything, Nikosh has been talking about, like monsters, scary things. This is actually the first year that he's ever even asked me about scary stuff. So people are asking, how do you address those fears while also trying to get them to sleep on their own?
Yeah, so I will also say that this is probably an answer that not everybody is going to like, and I want to be really honest about how to deal with this. So this is going to come down to a parent's, and usually a mom's, own comfort level with how she wants to parent. So whatever choice you make, even if there's an associated cost with that, it has to just be the choice that you morally feel okay with. So if what I'm going to say doesn't jive with you, that's okay, but you also might not have a child who sleeps. So I have 2 children. They are 9 currently as of this filming. They're 9 and 12. My 9-year-old has like a lot of fears. He was a way easier sleeper than my daughter, but fear has always been an issue for him. And my older child, she, I would say like has a normal amount of anxiety, maybe more like me, a little bit more than usual. So I've dealt with this anxiety and this fear throughout their childhood. And the fact of the matter is that especially the younger that the child is, the more that you acknowledge it, the worse it is going to be, because dealing with being scared it's a skill and it's a coping mechanism. So where some family might think like, hey, if I don't indulge this and I don't talk to them, I'm being cruel or I'm going to hurt them over the long term. A person is welcome to believe that and to apply that within their home. And that is not what my experience has been with all of the toddlers and my own children and all of my peers. And this is also going to come down to, once again, whether the child is sleep trained or whether they're not. So if your child is sleep trained and you run a home that's like very tight ship, very regimented, and there are some legitimate fears, acknowledging the child's fears and then explaining that they're still expected to fall asleep independently and leaving them alone is okay. This is something else that I usually have my clients talk to their pediatricians about and say, I have this fear issue with my child, and I say, hey, I love you, you're safe, you're okay, I know that you're upset, you need to go to sleep. Usually they develop a skill of dealing with the fear and then going back to sleep. It's typically only when parents start to really engage. And you have to remember too, once again, the younger that a child is, whatever you're acknowledging, that's a reality that you're creating for them. So if you indulge the fear too much, then they're going to think that there's really something to be afraid of. So there's something to be said about you saying, you do not need to be afraid of this, or you need to learn to deal with this fear, because the more that you don't do that, the harder that it can be. Another thing, and I think everybody knows this, but it really can be super helpful. You need to be really cognizant about what your child is being exposed to. It's very, very challenging, but if you have an extremely fearful child and there's a really big thing that's happening, try to go on a screen cleanse for 48 to 72 hours. Like that, all that stuff they're seeing, even if it's positive, it can just really engage that. And as hard as it is to not use screens, if you can cut them for like 3 straight days with no screens, sometimes it can help their brain kind of reset and those fears can go away.
Yeah, for sure. You know, hearing you say that, you're probably not gonna like how I handled addressing Nikash's fears. I actually gave him a crutch. So that's something I'm gonna have to address with him later on in life, who knows when. But I told him basically, don't worry, mommy's always watching you. And I showed him our camera, and I showed him on my phone, like, look, mommy's always watching you. Look, this is you right here on the camera. This is the camera. This is what mommy sees. Mommy's always watching you.
I think that's a great idea. I do these videos a lot, and I really try to be as helpful and specific as I can, but like people's situations, their children, the dynamic, their relationships, all very different. So having critical thinking skills and trusting your gut and being like, well, she's saying this concept that like the more I indulge it, the worse it's gonna be. So how can I address this in a firm way that acknowledges my child's feelings but doesn't keep me in the room? What you just said worked. And you know what? If he started to have an unhealthy fear of the camera, then you might be like, I'm gonna have to do something else because that's not working. So trust yourself a little bit. Use my general concepts that I'm sharing and then find ways that work for your family.
All right, so another question that seems to come up is the early morning wake up time. So they want their babies to sleep until 6:30 or 7, but their babies are waking up at like 4:30 or 5 a.m. So what would you recommend for that? And I know there are probably lots of instances or reasons why they do that.
Totally, yeah, okay. So early morning waking, I would say, is probably the single most common issue families deal with, even beyond sleep training, intermittently, typically for the first like even 1 to 2 years of life. This is whether or not a child is sleep trained. So this is something that can be helpful for everyone. Data has now shown us that there are lots of humans that are predisposed to waking up early each day. So this is all a biological issue. So whether or not you want your child to sleep in is unfortunately kind of irrelevant, because even if they're a great sleeper, they may have a hard time like sleeping soundly between 4 and 7 a.m. So you're not alone, very, very common. You may not be able to fix the problem, but here's what we can do. Always push for as late of a bedtime as your child can handle. I would say anything between the hours of like 6:30 or 7 p.m. and up to like 8:30 is a pretty decent bedtime for any child who's, let's say, 2.5 or younger. But if your child can handle being awake until 8 o'clock or 8:15, and this early morning issue is something that you're really struggling with, push that child's bedtime as late as you can. A lot of people will be like, they just wake up at the same time and then they're crabby. And usually what that means is you haven't done it for long enough, consistently enough. So if you just keep doing it for 2 to 3 weeks, anytime you make a shift with your child's schedule, it feels a lot to them like jet lag, which is pretty terrible. And so you are responding obviously to your child's like frustration. You're thinking, see, this isn't working. Really, you just need to give it more time. So stick to a later bedtime, as late as your child can comfortably handle, for 2 to 3 weeks, and see if that results a little bit of a later wake up time. 2, make sure that that room is as pitch black as it can possibly be, and use white noise. Even the most minor amount of sunlight coming up can trigger the brain to stop producing melatonin. So if your room is not darkened, it's actually the most important that it's darkened for those early morning hours. And I'll say you can head to babysleeptrainer.com. My blog has like a lot of detailed blog posts, but there's one on early morning waking, and then there's several on nap transitions. So if your child is around the age of 7 or 8 months, or maybe 12, 13, 14 months, and they're still doing 3 naps to 2 or 2 naps to 1, those blog posts will be really helpful, because sometimes it's needing to be a nap transition, or it's a time when your child can transition. So if you have an 8-month-old who's still taking 3 naps, who wakes up at 5:30, you may not want to cut their naps because their naps are so short. You really need to cut their naps anyway and give it a few weeks, and that will help their early morning waking. And then one thing that I advise you to do, and I really am pretty militant with I hate to use that word, but I would say that I'm the most militant about this one particular piece of advice if you sleep train, is to be really, really consistent about setting a firm start time of every day. Even if your child's awake before that, as long as you know that they're healthy and safe, and as long as you're comfortable with it, say, we don't get up to start our day in the Willis household until 6:30 in the morning. You can wake up whenever you want, and it can be agonizing, and it can be weeks. But I can assure you that if you simply set this as a time, 6:30, no matter how long it takes, your child, just like they learn to entertain themselves at bedtime, will learn to entertain themselves and wait for you, even if it takes a long time, until a firm start time. And to be honest, a child who's awake but is in a dark room with loud white noise, it's less stimulating, the input through their ears and their eyes, so they will still be able to last until their first scheduled nap time, even if they woke up at 5:30, because it was far less stimulating for them to be in a dark room with white noise as opposed to being up and awake with you early in the morning.
That makes sense. So you're like, they just had a time of like, almost like meditation, like just lay there, hang out,
and they may be crying
chill
for the first several weeks.
Yeah.
And if you're comfortable with that and you know they're safe, or once again, don't do this, and that's okay, but that means that your child's gonna keep waking up early.
I think women get confused, and I even saw this in one of the questions about this. You hear that whole saying like sleep begets sleep, right?
Yeah.
So then they're like, I put my baby down earlier and earlier, and she's still not sleeping, later into the morning. So you're saying that this might be a different issue, and putting them to sleep later might be what they need.
And I would say families know their children, and they know if early morning waking is really an issue versus like, I nurse my child to sleep all the time. I nurse them to sleep at 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. And so maybe this is an issue of your child not knowing how to fall asleep independently. Anytime anybody has any issue, if that child is not going down completely alone, awake, and able to fall asleep independently, that always needs to be the first thing that you address. But like I said, even if your child is sleep trained or not, the early morning waking issue can often persist. So assuming you've dealt with any other issue that it might be, if your child, especially if they're sleep trained, I would say a later bedtime is going to be okay. And I'm not talking about 10 o'clock. I'm saying if they go to bed at 7, maybe push to 7:30. If it's 7:45, maybe push to 8:30, even if you feel like they're crabby at first, because they need a finite amount of sleep. Once they've been sleep trained and they fall asleep on their own, their body knows what it's doing, and it takes its opportunities to sleep when it can. And if they biologically can't stay asleep early in the morning, pushing their bedtime a little bit later is eventually going to help them sleep in a little bit later in the morning. It just takes time and consistency.
So one of the questions I thought was really interesting, she said that her toddler was an amazing sleeper until just last month, and she wants to know why the sudden change. Like, why do babies and toddlers suddenly have, I guess, regressions is what we tend to hear, right? Why do they have these regressions? How can they go from being these great sleepers to suddenly not, and then suddenly sleeping again? We go through the ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure. So in my expert opinion, and having worked with a lot of kids, I think there's only a few actual sleep regressions that occur consistently for most children. One around 4 months of age, one around 10 to 12 months of age, and then another one sometime in the second year of life, whether it's right when they turn 2 or it's somewhere in that earlier part. So this is when a child is sleeping well. Let's assume again they're sleep trained, and then there's this marked change, and then they may go back to sleeping properly if you handle it correctly. Then you also have this issue of like randomly at 8 months old or 2.5 or whenever, they were sleeping great and now they aren't. So both of these situations you should actually handle in the exact same way. And this is mostly for families who find that their child is sleep trained, they are an independent sleeper, and then suddenly they start having issues. So anybody else, if you think of a given month, like unless you're my husband, like people wake up, they have issues, like something's going on with their stomach, something's stressing them out, they don't know why they're awake, they're just awake. Kids are the same way. So you should expect your child maybe as often as every 4 to 8 weeks to have a night where they don't sleep very well. It all comes down to how you react to that, whether it's a sincere, real regression in that, 4 month or 8 month, or 10 month or whatever, or whether it's just like, this randomly happened. Always go to your child, always physically check on them and see if you can identify what's wrong. If you can identify what is wrong, address what's wrong. If your child is sick, then address that with however the doctor tells you to do it. So medication or stay with them or whatever. If they're completely fine, then they're completely fine. Whatever it is, deal with what you find is wrong and then put them down awake and let them fall back to sleep on their own. And if they're sick, room sharing with them is what I would advise. So maybe letting them fall asleep and then entering the room and sleeping with them. But it's only when parents start to make a choice to assist their child to sleep again that regardless of whether it's an official regression or one of these random issues, where the child suddenly deviates and is no longer sleeping well. And Susan, I don't know if you have had like an experience like this with either of your kids, but
so many. I mean, Nikosh became unsleep trained. Like the undoing of the sleep training was he got sick at one point, and I started to let him sleep with me again. And it wasn't room sharing. It was he would literally fall asleep next to me, cuddled up to me, and he got used to that. He was like, well, this is nice. Why would I go back to the other thing? And then it just felt harder and harder to go back to just sleep training. And I've thought about that so many times with Isla. Now with my 1-year-old, I'm like, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to let her use me as a crutch all over again because that's how I messed it up last time. Right. And I think, again, knowledge and understanding of like, okay, what is actually happening here? And know the choice you're making. So if you are going to hold your child because they're sick, like that, everybody does that. You just need to be aware that you are making a decision that's going to trigger you to have to do something else in order to get them sleep trained again. Instead of being like, how come every time my kid gets sick, sleep training goes out the window? That's not actually what's happening. What's happening is every time your kid gets sick, you're assisting them to sleep. They lose the ability to fall asleep independently, and then you have to train them again. They wouldn't have lost it had you made a different decision. And so just be aware of what you're doing with whatever decision you're making and just kind of acknowledge that and own that and then do whatever you need to do to address that in the future. All right, so another question that seems like it's a really popular question is essentially, when moms are still breastfeeding a toddler, like sometimes you breastfeed past 1, sometimes even past 2. I think for especially the moms who are in that in between of like weaning their baby, sometimes their toddler still, will go to sleep either feeding or they wake up in the middle of the night still wanting to be fed. What is your advice for that? Yeah, so first and foremost, don't cut any night feedings for your child without talking to your doctor first. There's any number of reasons why your doctor might want you to keep a feed. I almost never encounter a doctor who tells their patient to keep feedings past a year, but we never know what your particular situation is. Really what you want to ask your doctor is if your child is eating at all overnight, and especially if they're eating regularly, whether they're nursing or bottle feeding, but especially if they're nursing, you want to say, my daughter's name is Olive, I would say, hi, Dr. So-and-so, I'd like to know if Olive can go 12 hours overnight without eating, yes or no? How many feedings does she need overnight? This is mainly for toddlers, so we're going to assume the doctor's going to say, no, they don't need any feedings, okay? And you're also wanting to ask, are you comfortable with me cutting the feedings cold turkey? And this is a breastfeeding question, but this applies for both bottle and breastfeeding, right? So as long as the doctor says, yes, your child can go 12 hours overnight without eating, yes, you can stop feeding them cold turkey. This is truly the most humane way to approach this. People think that weaning is much better. It generally isn't. It really upsets the child, and then you have all this crying and screaming. They do not understand what you are doing, and it makes the whole situation a lot worse. The body is designed, the hormones are designed to like diminish the appetite overnight and increase it during the day. And so your child probably isn't even waking that hungry every time they wake up. This is just something they're using to go back to sleep. Even if you wean your child at night, you still do need to focus on teaching them to fall asleep independently during the day, but we'll put that aside for just a second. So let's say the doctor has said, yes, cut the feedings cold turkey, and you are like, great, because I don't want to nurse anymore overnight. Do not stop nursing cold turkey overnight, even if you cut your child cold turkey from nursing for them. Because if you do that, it would say even like 6 to 7 hours suddenly or longer, you could trigger postpartum mood disorders. And a lot of people don't know that. It is incredibly common for women as after a year, 2 years, to now have postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression because they suddenly weaned their child overnight.
So use your breast pump. Try, if you are like, my kid nurses all night long, I don't even know how many feedings they're having, right? Try to think about how many times you experience a letdown overnight, and maybe hopefully you're feeling letdowns, but just get a sense of, is it 4 feedings, is it 3? And then you wanna like cut those feedings down like 1 every 5 to 7 days, which I know sounds insane to use a pump overnight while you're weaning your child, but to be honest, if you want to be safe, the smart way to do it is to step down your own production over time, even if you're stopping your child's feedings cold turkey. You also need a plan for what to do when your child wakes up crying and wants to eat. This is also called sleep training. So you probably want to make sure that you know what you're going to do, and feel free, by the way, to stop all overnight feedings, but keep feedings during the day, especially if your child's on an eat, wake, sleep cycle. I think it's fabulous when women nurse however long they want to, and it is not true that sleep training and breastfeeding are anathema to one another. Pretty much every mother that works in my programs or works with me is able to maintain breastfeeding as long as they wish. So you can do both. You just don't want to go at it alone without like any information.
Okay, so let's get to our last question. There are so many more questions we can address, but let's get to the other one that's pretty popular, and that is, how do you transition your toddler from a crib, whether they're 1, 2, 3? I wish I could have kept Nikosh in a crib till 3. He just was adamant he wasn't gonna do it. But if they're like, 2 or 3, and you wanna transition them now to a bed, what do you do? What are your best tips?
Yeah, so first of all, please do not take your child who's happy and sleeping in a crib out of a crib just because you have another baby and you want that crib for the baby. Don't do that. That's a huge mistake. And there's a very valuable piece of advice that I can give everybody that's watching is, don't do that. Go on Craigslist, buy another crib, put that baby in a pack and play, whatever. Do not take a child that is happy in their crib out of their crib. Also, even if you don't have another baby, this is not a milestone that people need to be like, yes, like I like should be putting my kid in a bed. No, you should want to keep your toddler in their crib rather, as long as they're happy to stay there. If they haven't exceeded the manufacturer recommendations for when they can sleep in there, they're not trying to climb out, that kid can be in there till they're like 4. No problem at all whatsoever. So don't be in a hurry to do it. Let's say that for some reason you have a child that you feel strongly wants to get out of their crib, or for whatever reason you need to transition them. I would avoid it until they're 2.5 or older. You don't want to make the transition before 2.5. After 2.5, this is kind of actually, it brings us full circle to what we were talking about earlier, which is you need to have a plan. Unfortunately, there's all this information like, just go get them a bed that they like, and then that's going to work for like a day or 2. And your son's be like, great, I love this new bed. And then they're gonna get up and they're gonna leave the room. So you have to figure out a way to establish a guideline and a boundary. So when I have clients who come to me with their child in a crib, who's 3, and they want to make the transition into a bed, I walk them through what you and I talked about, right? So we create a whole plan, we set the expectations, we're very clear, we tell them that their responsibility is to stay in their room. Really, they should even call you from their room if they need you. Train them to stay in the room. If there was, God forbid, if they were 3.5 and they threw up and they were in a crib and they couldn't get out, they would still call to you. So asking them to call to you from their bedroom, even if they're in a bed or standing in the doorway, if you have an obedient or a compliant child, set these guidelines like right when you make the transition. Don't be reactive, right? You want to make sure that you're being really clear with them from the very beginning.
This was so helpful, Natalie. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're
Where
welcome.
Can people find you?
babysleeptrainer.com, on Instagram, on YouTube. I am all over the internet at Baby Sleep Trainer.
If you guys have any other questions for Natalie too, you can ask them in the comments below. If there are enough questions, we can even maybe do a part 2 video.
I would love to.
Thank you guys for watching, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.